Welcome to Science Actually, a podcast by Imperial College London students and staff. In our podcast, we explore the misconception around the human body. In each episode, a member of a podcast team interviews Imperial's experts to see if they have the answers to our burning questions.
Hi, my name is Hendrik Vogt. I'm a final year biological sciences student at Imperial College. This Science Actually podcast delves into food. Our guest here with us today is Professor Maria Charalambides. Maria is a pioneer in the field of mechanics of materials and has been lecturing at Imperial College for the good part of over 2 decades. She now leads an incredibly well-funded and successful research group investigating soft solids with over 100 publications, many of these being recognised for their academic excellence. This episode will focus on one of Maria's research topics, where she looks into how to engineer chocolate to enhance taste, reduce excess sugar intake, and consequently tackle health-associated diseases. Thank you for joining us here today, Maria. We're very happy to have you for this discussion. I think it'd be really interesting for the audience to hear how you came about investigating the chocolate and the career path that you took.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Hendrik, for your very kind introduction. So I was hired as a young lecturer in 1997 in the mechanical engineering department here at Imperial College. Before that, I was an undergrad and a PhD student in the same department, and so this is in mechanical engineering. So in 1997, the then head of the department, this was Professor Gordon Williams, had the vision that foods would be what polymers were for mechanical engineering research. So basically, if you look at a mechanical engineering department, what we were looking at in terms of materials research was a lot on metals mechanics. So when his career took over, he did a lot of polymers research. So he thought that foods was a kind of a new material that will take off. And he wanted to have this new lectureship to bring the food research into the department. So I applied for the post. I had by then done a very short postdoctoral project on how aging in cheese causes biochemical changes. This is protein matrix breakdown and its impact on the mechanics of the cheese, mechanical properties, which will then directly correlate with consumer perception, perhaps. So I got the job and I was thrilled because that stage an academic career is what I always wanted to follow. So I was very happy to begin on my this career path. Although I should say that I had only done that for 1 year. Before that, my PhD and my other postdoctoral work was looking at materials that are used in the aircraft industry, like glass fiber, reinforced polymers and so on, and how they break and so on. So it wasn't, majority of it was not in food, but it didn't really matter because it's the fundamentals and the theory that you learn when you're training as an engineer, and then you can apply it to lots of different applications. This is what I love doing actually as an engineer.
So it'd be interesting then to hear why you think studying food is so important and why this work wasn't perhaps done as much as it should have been in the past.
Yeah, thank you, Hendrik. That's a very good question. So I think we all know by now that we are what we eat. There's so much publicity at present on how poor diets lead to non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, some cancers, cardiovascular problems, and so on. And actually, the current epidemic with COVID has also brought this to our attention in the most tragic of ways. So, but even before that, I have always thought that there's plenty of really nice, exciting research related to human health. And this is biomechanics. So, for example, if I look at teams in my department, there's people looking at bones, how they change with age, leading to osteoporosis, hip replacements, and there's people that look into blood flows. People also research brain tumor surgeries, how do you make tools, how do you invent new tools to cope with such very challenging surgeries. So these are all very exciting problems where the skills of a mechanical engineer will be well suited. However, understanding what happens to the food once ingested, so this is once it's in your body, is very under-researched by comparison with all these other more high-profile research in biomechanical research. And if you consider that many health problems are caused because of food diets, then it's strange that we're not really looking into that in more detail. So it is so important to use engineering to research what happens to the food and whether it delivers the nutrients to the human body, what is the physiological response to the food uptake, what do consumers like eating and why. All these are really key questions which, if we find the answers, then possible impact, it could be revolutionary basically for changing people's diets and their health.
It's very interesting to hear that. And then going on to a bit more about the work that you did, there have been correlations that have been drawn between chocolate consumption and student lifestyle, which is particularly relevant for the audience listening, or well, at least me. Your research looks at how adding bubbles to chocolate changed the perception of taste. Could you briefly summarise how you went about investigating the effects of added chocolate on taste perception?
So about 3-4 years ago, we got some funding with the 2 PhD students to look into how microaeration affects the mechanical properties and the oral process completely, because that affects consumer perception. So what we have found is that by introducing tiny small pores and microbubbles inside the chocolate, and these are so small, in the order of 10-20 microns, that you cannot actually see them, so you do not see that you're actually having a different product. By having these bubbles in the material, when the chocolate is put inside your mouth, it creates an event which is characterized by higher fragmentation. So basically we did some experiments where we took a chocolate without pores and a chocolate with the pores, and we put them inside plastic bags, and we took volunteers and we asked them to chew on the plastic bags with the chocolate piece inside with the molar teeth at the back teeth. And then we measured after the 1 bite, 2 bites, how big the particles were. And you compare them with the solid reference chocolate to the chocolate with the pores. And we saw that the one with the pores, because of these bubbles, the holes that was inside the material, the chocolate broke into smaller, higher number and smaller number of pieces, fragments. That means that you expose a surface area of the product which is higher in that case when you have the aerated chocolate, and therefore there's more chance that the product will come into contact with specialized sensors. So these are taste buds in your mouth, and that of course has an impact on the perception. Also, if the pieces were small, we found that they melted faster. So, Hendrik, I think it's important here to say that engineers are used to using models for designing bridges and aeroplane structures. Can we do the same for foods? And that's a very exciting question. So what we found is that if we've taken such a holistic systems view of what happens mechanically, thermally, even tripologically is the study of friction. So I had collaborators in mechanical engineering that looked at different parts of this complex chain of events that happens in our process. And we found that the microaerated chocolate led to, as I said before, a higher fragmentation. These then led to melting, which was a lot faster. The surfaces which are introduced, which are much larger now because you've got lots of tiny little pieces, are sensed maybe more in the mouth. And we have evidence that this happened because in collaboration with our sponsors, we also did sensory studies. So we looked at having trained panels who'd rated the two different chocolates, and the really interesting thing was that the sweetness was perceived around the same. And of course, if you have one product with the same volume, so basically you buy a bar of chocolate which has exactly the same volume, but one has microaerated pores in it, you're actually eating less of everything because there's air now that's replaced some of the product. So you're consuming less calories, but the consumers, these trained panels, they thought that even though they were eating less sugar, they found the sweetness was the same in the two chocolates, which is a very exciting result. This could be something that we can explore in the future.
That's definitely really exciting to hear. I think you mentioned your collaborators. Is that then a chocolate company that funds the project?
Yes, this research is funded by Nestlé, the Engineering and Physical Research Council, and one of the PhD students also had a President's Scholarship, the Imperial College President's Scholarship.
Seems to be quite a lot of interest in chocolate then.
Yeah.
Definitely. So do you think then, because you mentioned that the perception of the taste is sweeter when it's aerated using the testing panel?
The sweetness was the same. So basically you got two chocolates which have the same volume, but one has less sugar because some of the product is replaced by air. However, the sweetness is perceived the same. So you actually ate less sugar, but the sweetness was perceived the same.
So do you think then that the way it melts in the mouth, that is favoured by the consumer? Do you think that contributes to why aerated chocolate bars such as Aero are so popular?
Okay, so Aero is different to the chocolate that we've studied because you can see the bubbles when you're eating.
Okay, and yours is micron.
Ours are micron, you cannot really see them. So it's very interesting actually because the visual thing could also possibly affect your perception. So if you see the bubbles there, I don't know, maybe you expect something already because it's bubbly. And the interesting thing in our research was that the bubbles could not be seen. So tens of microns by the human eye. So the differences that we found in the sensory perception in the studies that we've done with our sponsors, it was down to the structural breakdown path only, which then affects the chain of events happening in the mouth that I highlighted earlier. And of course, structural breakdown is what engineers like my research group, this is what we can do. This is what we are doing, and we will do that.
That's interesting. So do you think then that, because you look at the breakdown of the chocolate, do you think then that the effect of age has a significant effect on the perception of chocolates?
Yes, definitely. So there's a lot of literature and a lot of studies out there for designing foods and beverages for the elderly specifically, who might have trouble swallowing safely or having missing teeth, higher chance that's happening at that age. So as engineers, we could in the future study how we need to tweak food products to ensure that they do not cause such problems, for example, in the elderly. And as highlighted earlier, the oral process is a chain of physical and chemical events that if we unlock and understand, we can start designing new food structures, new food formulations and products to solve such problems for both old and young people in our population.
That's a very interesting answer. So if the elderly population chew less or chew more, that in turn have an effect on the melting point and could potentially alter the taste.
It will have an effect on the whole oral process, Hendrik. So it's a mechanical action when you we're talking about solid foods. It's a mechanical action. You put it inside your mouth. And actually, even if we don't talk about the elderly and the young, even the same age, people chew in different ways. This is very widely known. And this is a problem when you try and do lots of sensory studies with a lot of people. You will find that you will get very high variation in the data that you collect. And this is a reflection of the different masticatory chewing patterns of each individual. And what makes this research even more complicated is, as I said earlier, is that the material that you're chewing is very complex. So if you chew it fast or if you chew it slowly, it would behave in a different manner. So I could be eating the same thing as you, but if you chew it faster, you could potentially sense higher forces than me, where I'm doing it more slowly, because these are not linear elastic materials. So all of these things are things that kind of murk the issue a little bit, the problems, and it makes it very difficult to understand what's going on. And this is why we need solid foundational mathematical models that take into account all these possible differences in masticatory patterns. And then we can, using those models, we can see what the effect is on the oral process. And then we can understand fully what's going on, the physics behind the process.
That's fascinating. So then after you've done your results of your current research on aerated chocolate, what would your next steps be that you would undertake?
Yeah, I think it's very exciting that we're building models, for example, that can predict these fracture paths, this fragmentation that I was mentioning earlier. So imagine now we make some structures which we model, and then we know where the fracture paths are. Could we place sugar morphines, for example, only in those fracture paths, such that they're tasted when they're consumed? So, for example,
at the moment, there's a lot of salt and sugar that is in the products that we're eating, that we're ingesting, and we're not even sensing it. So could it be that we only place it in strategic places such that, we do get the benefit from sensorially, the taste, but we do not ingest those that we do not really, get any pleasure out of. So that's an important problem, and it could lead to new designs, maybe of products, of food products, and that will help us to tackle obesity and diabetes, for example. And it will be a very crucial new food design tool. And of course, this is what engineers do all the time when they try and make whether it's you're designing a bridge or an airplane, you want a design tool. Why not do this for foods? This is what we're trying to advocate.
Do you think that, because it was shown in a particular study that younger generations, when they eat chocolate, have high levels of guilt, but their mindfulness levels were low. So then do you think by placing these sugar molecules to make chocolate healthier, do you think then it will alter guilty or mindfulness?
Well, I think we need to be a little bit careful here, because of course somebody could say, well, you made chocolate healthier, I'm going to eat more. And then you end up having the same thing. So this is an area like the social science, so it's not my area, so I'm not really an expert. I cannot comment on that. But it's basically our research is such that you can make a product which is less energy dense, so you can still enjoy it without having such a negative impact on your health. But it shouldn't be like, okay, if it's healthier, then I'm going to eat more. This is something that you need to think about, yeah.
Okay. What significance of the research in terms of the global food industry? Like you mentioned placing the sugar molecules in the chocolate, and perhaps how this may affect food policies in the future.
So I agree with you that any big problems that are out there, that our society is facing, be it, changing solutions of plastic pollution or, climate change, poor diets, all of these are big societal problems which require a very large team of experts in various disciplines. So, yeah, we need people that will look into policies and so on. My research is only technological. So we look at, applying engineering to design better products, food products that are still liked by the consumer, for example. But we need to collaborate with social scientists, policymakers, to ensure that we take advantage of any technological advances that are made in this field. Otherwise, such advances, will not be taken up because maybe of potential highest cost, for example, and then we will not reap any benefits from this research. So it's definitely, we need a systems approach. So an important angle is how should policies change to facilitate any technological advances that are made. And currently, there's a very interesting debate going on the news, and the suggestion that we should introduce sugar salt tax in foods, and that could drive a positive change, as it did in beverages, when they introduced this sugar tax. There's a lot that we and the government need to do to ensure to find a fair way to change people's diets. And the obvious thing, of course, is to increase the amount of fruit and veg, natural products that we eat. However, people will always go for snacks and ready-made products because of our busy lifestyles. You said students are one group of people, but it goes throughout the society. So we have to make these products healthier while still liked by the consumers. So there's something there that we can do to help with that.
Mm-hmm. If you could place the sugar molecules and where you taste it, do you think then companies would then use that to circumvent the issue of sugar tax?
The food industry is facing big pressures to reduce the sugar, the salt and fat. So if we find together with them, where we're working with them, if we find ways such that we can create foods with less of this sugar, salt and fat that still behave in the same manner in the oral process and gives whatever nutritional value we were aiming for, then that will help the industry meet their goals. And this is one of their main aims at the moment. This is what they're working on, to try and find ways to do that. And this is why we're collaborating with them on that.
Okay. And you mentioned before about tackling diabetes and diet-related health conditions. Your research group has also looked at the mechanics of the digestive system. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about how you investigated the mechanics of the digestive system and what you found?
Yeah, So we have built in silico models. This is what they use, basically computational models that can show how food flows and breaks down in the stomach. So after it's left your mouth, and the mouth, basically what happens in the mouth will affect consumer perception. And then once the food goes down to the esophagus, to the stomach and the small intestine, that's where the nutrients will be taken up. So we're interested to see that aspect as well, not just the oral process and which is linked on the consumer perception. So we've built these in silico models that show how the food flows and breaks down in the stomach as it enters the small intestine through the pylorus. And the small intestine is where the nutrients get absorbed. That's why we're interested in that area. So one thing that I learned because I had to collaborate with nutrition specialists and so on, so it was a whole new area for me as well, and I learned a lot of stuff. And one of the really interesting things that I learned is that when you buy a product and there's nutrients at the back of the pack, it does not mean that you will access those nutrients just because they're available to you. It means you won't access them. So whether you will or not largely depends on how the food will behave, how it will break down, how it will flow in this gastrointestinal tract. So for example, it's known that carbohydrate-rich foods, which lack structure due to intensive processing, highly processed food, they break down very quickly in the gastrointestinal tract because of this lack of structure and mechanical integrity. And this is associated with high glycemic index, possibly affects negatively your appetite regulation. If your food leaves your stomach earlier, it could potentially, it means that you might get hungrier quicker. And this has a direct link to problems such as obesity, for example. So we're collaborating with School of Medicine, nutritionists to try and make such in silico models and use them to understand the link between the food structure and the physiological response, which has an impact on the health.
Okay. So you mentioned about highly processed carbohydrate foods having an impact of being taken in quicker or being absorbed quicker, so that contributes to obesity and diabetes. So would you then advise either staying away from these highly processed foods or going towards developing carbohydrate-rich foods that are not so processed or engineering them to have stronger structures?
I have, this is just my personal opinion. We've all been told for so long, this, we all know it. But, they're there, we like them, we eat them. Can we make them better? I think that could be an interesting avenue instead of just keep on advising people, obviously, do not eat too much of this, try and limit it. I think that's a very sensible option. At the same time, parallel to that, can we try and make some products which will have the right structures to give the better response? And we can learn from this, from nature. We can look at natural products, like there's a lot of research on peas, for example, what different types of peas, they have different structures. Why is it that some structures lead to least glycemic index and others not? So we can learn from nature, the structures from nature to try and design new products, perhaps that could be better for human health.
Would that be something that you personally would be interested in pursuing in your lab?
Absolutely, yeah. That would be really nice. And, this sort of nature mimicking thing is not new. There's biomimetics, there's people that look into a lot of natural materials. Like one example that comes to my mind now is in adhesion, with the gecko. Why is it that the gecko, stays when it's upside down on the ceiling?
Okay. So the gecko sticking to the wall, isn't there? And looking at how the mechanics.
Yeah.
Okay. And it'd be interesting to see from your own perspective how far you think the investigation of the mechanics of food has come. Because when you first started, the mechanics of food was barely investigated. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think this field has come through a great deal. It has progressed a lot. So in the past, when I first started, I was one of the few people working in this area. Now there are more and more people interested in this fascinating field, which combines so many different disciplines. So this is engineering, natural sciences, food science, sensory psychology experts, social science, economics, etc. So there's a it's a very fascinating problem, and it's a problem which lends itself to building large teams for working together to solve this. So even from my department, I can see there's more and more people now working on food, whereas in the past I was the only person.
I see. It's come on leaps and bounds there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then how do you think this investigation into mechanics of food has changed how people view an engineer?
Okay, so I think like food engineering is a new field in engineering, and as such, it has its advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages is if you work in this area, there's not much literature that you can rely on, so you have to innovate right from the first go. So if you were working on metals research, for example, there's so much out there that you can read, and helps you to make a start basically. Whereas food research it's a newer subject, and there's not a lot of theory still that's been developed to help you along with your research. However, the advantages is that, well, there's a lot of advantages. One is that whatever you discover is good because it's new. So there's a high chance of, you can make more novel discoveries, but also it does not bring with it any baggage, I call it. Like, for example, engineering is a topic which has been dominated by a specific group. So for mechanical engineering, this was men, for example. A lot of it was considered like a male sort of profession. So you would not think as a mechanical engineer you could be studying what happens to food inside your body. So it's a new area. So because it's new, it has potential to break down such stereotypes, because people don't look at it as saying, oh, but this thing is only been looked at by men, therefore if I'm a woman, it's not my thing, I'll think of something else. Because it's new, doesn't have any stereotypes, and that will increase the diversity of our profession for sure.
That's a very interesting point, yeah, definitely. So it could be breaking down the stereotypes and making it more inclusive to females as well, doing engineering.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Maria. It's been incredibly interesting to listen to your research and having you as a guest as part of our podcast.
Thank you very much, Hendrik. It was really nice chatting with you about this. Thanks a lot.